Hello everyone, Professor Wolf here. I'm making this video for students in my Introduction to Philosophy class at College of DuPage in fall 2025. We're in a unit on ethics. You have an in-class assignment on ethics. There are 4 questions on this assignment. One of the questions, question 3, asks about arguments against cultural relativism that I presented in class. The question says, I will give you 10 arguments against cultural relativism in class, and that you need to write on 3 of them. Your choice, except you have to address the first argument, that is the argument from horrendous evils. Now, we ran out of time a bit in class the other day. I didn't have time to get to all 10 arguments. I believe we covered 6 or 7 of them. In this video, time permitting, I will actually cover 12. I'd really like this video to wrap up in under an hour or no more than 75 minutes. I'm sure you would really like that too. So some of these arguments I'm going to have to cover a bit quickly. A few preliminary issues. First of all, any one of these arguments could be analyzed at length from different perspectives. I am not trying to imply here to my students, or I don't know, anybody else who might happen to stumble upon this video, that I'm treating of these arguments collectively or even singularly in a remotely exhaustive manner in this video. Of course, that's just to say, just a fancy way of saying, of course, for pretty much all these arguments, there's more that can be said. However, I think everything I'm going to say has at least something going for it. And even though there may be responses to a number of these arguments, there are also responses to those responses. And I believe at the end of the day, many of these arguments at least are really quite strong against cultural relativism. But if you're curious about what a cultural relativist might say in response, well, sometimes I'll let you know. But if you'd like to hear more, just let me know. Another thing, we shouldn't understand the arguments in such a way that cultural relativism is seriously challenged only if one of these arguments on its own is decisive against cultural relativism. So if we think of ranking these arguments on a scale of 0 to 10 in accordance with their force against cultural relativism, the idea being that if we would give a particular argument a 0, that would mean it doesn't touch cultural relativism at all. But if we were to give it a 10, that would mean that argument alone is enough to refute 100% cultural relativism. I don't think we should say that we should only give up cultural relativism if at least one of these arguments is a 10. I mean, you might think in that case, basically, you wouldn't give a 10 for anything, right? And maybe that's a bit too strong. Maybe we should weaken our expectations a bit. Okay, I don't want to get too fancy with that. I don't want to get too lost in the weeds. You know, you could just take it a 10 would for you. That's enough for you. That's enough for you to give up on the position entirely, right? I'm not asking you to rank the arguments in this way for the assignment. I asked you to do it in class, not for the assignment. But my point here is that even if none of these arguments, even if not a single one of them is such that that argument alone would be enough for you to be completely convinced or basically completely convinced that cultural relativism is misguided, that doesn't mean you shouldn't be so convinced, because it might be that when we take 2 or 3 or 4 of these arguments together they make a very, very, very strong case, perhaps even a compelling case, that cultural relativism is wrong, right? That it can't be right. This is a point you can make in a lot of other areas in philosophy. So, for example, we have these arguments for God. We have these arguments against God. Now, it's often understood, it's often assumed that in order to make a really good case for God or a really good case against God, you need like one argument to basically be a proof in a really, really, really strong sense. So it has to be 100% totally and completely free of any sort of potential flaw. Or if not quite that strong, at least it has to be overwhelmingly convincing for you. Okay. That the only way you should believe in God, that God exists or that God doesn't exist, is if you can find at least one argument that's that strong. That might just be too much to ask in a lot of cases. It might be we want to look at a cumulative case. We might talk about a number of arguments working together to raise the probability of a certain conclusion, to make it plausible, but perhaps even to make it compelling. But the point is, we don't have to expect 100% proofs, and we don't have to expect one argument and only one argument to carry all the weight. At the same time, we need to be careful because sometimes people will just throw a bunch of mud at the wall and see what sticks. They might throw out 14 arguments for something against something, recognizing that some of those arguments are not really all that awesome, but maybe some are kind of okay, and or at least don't immediately fail. And hey, I just threw out a bunch of stuff, so you should be persuaded. Yeah, we don't want to fall into that either. It can be a little bit tricky, okay? Another thing I'd want to add before we get into this is that some of you, I imagine maybe many of you, given what we've already said about these issues in class, are pretty strongly persuaded that cultural relativism has to be right about at least some things. And then you encounter these arguments, the ones I'm about to give, some of which we already covered in class. And then you start to think, well, I don't think it could be right about everything. And then you might wonder, is there a way to combine them? And many people would say, well, no, you can't. I mean, they're just fundamentally opposed when you look at the definitions, objectivism and cultural relativism. And some might not be quite persuaded of that. So what should we say? I would say this. I will not go into this in this video. I will do it in another video. And perhaps we'll review it in class. There's no reason to think objectivism is incompatible with some forms of situationalism. It can allow for some variation. It can allow for some variation. Actually, I will just really quickly give you an example to help drive home the point. We typically think of medicine as objective, and it's not relative, it's not subjective in the sense that, a medicine works for you just in case you believe it does, though actually that gets a little bit complicated because of placebo effects and mind over matter and things like this, right? But certainly, let's get a really clear case, right? Let's get a really clear example. You fall from a fence and you break your leg pretty badly, let's say. Well, I think we all agree in that case, your broken leg is not going to repair itself instantly just because you want it to. And it's not going to repair itself instantly if you tell yourself, all I have to do is, I don't know, drink a glass of orange juice. And because I say so, that'll make any broken limb instantly better. No, it might, it may not speed the recovery at all. And if it does, that's not because you think orange juice helps you, but I don't know, maybe even there could be a little bit of placebo effect, whatever. But okay, let's just stick with the really kind of stark example. You break your leg really badly. It ain't getting better right away just because you wanted to or because you ate an M&M and you told yourself an M&M will make it get better right away. I mean, at least to a large extent, medicine is objective and not subjective in that kind of a way. And maybe we even want to try to make sense of some kind of objective account for placebo effects, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. There is that objectivism, but you can still have some variation to this extent. There could be more than one way to successfully treat a broken leg. Okay? Something like that. Maybe there's some kind of bacterial infection or viral infection, right? That really has to be treated with medication, but maybe there could be 2 or 3 or 4 different variants of the medication or many variants of medication to do the job, right? There's a lot of other examples that could be given. The one I typically like to give is this. If you strike a match, like if I were to strike a match right now in this room on planet Earth, it would light. If an astronaut on a spacewalk out in space were to strike a match somehow with those gloves, I don't know how you do it, but suppose they do it, the match wouldn't light. Why? No oxygen. So the match lights on Earth, it doesn't light in space. There is a kind of variation there, right? It's not relativism, though. At least it's not relativism in the sense that there's different laws of physics, space physics and Earth physics. And it's definitely not the case that the match lights according to the whim of the person trying to light it. It's not that the one doesn't light in space because the astronaut doesn't really want it to light. No, it's like the physics that person doesn't control, right? It's the same physics up there and down here. The difference is what else is in the environment. There is a kind of variation then, a variability. I mean, I guess you could call that in a way you could say, well, in a way that's sort of like being relative. It's relative to Earth, relative to space, light's relative to Earth, not relative to space, light's relative to presence of oxygen, not relative to absence of oxygen. Okay, I mean, in a sense, English lets you speak of a kind of relativism there. But that's not at all the type of relativism we're talking about in ethics, where it's people's beliefs, preferences, customs, whatever, that make the thing true. Here, it's the laws of physics are objective and they're discovered, not created. Cultural relativism is saying that ethics is created, not discovered. It's a totally different type of relativism. So it's helpful here to use relativism only in one way, to use it for the type of relativism we're talking about with cultural relativism, right? Where we're saying that it's like human beings, it's our minds, it's our beliefs, it's our desires, whatever, that create morality, and it's created, not discovered. It's a very different thing with the laws of physics. There is a kind of variation, though, there with the physics, not in the laws themselves, but on what's around for them to act on. So we might just use another term like situationalism or complexity, something like that. Moral objectivism can definitely allow for situational variation. It can definitely allow for complexity. Why shouldn't it be able to do that? If the laws of physics can do that, why shouldn't the laws of morality? And if we've talked about what makes it right or wrong, good or bad, to steal or take a life depends on the circumstances. You can't take somebody's life out of greed, but you can out of self-defense. And of course you can expect situational variation with moral objectivism, just as you can you can allow for it, right? I was about to finish that sentence by saying just as you can on relativism, but actually it's actually different. I'm not going to pursue this further here. I will make a separate video on this, but actually what I would argue is that cultural relativism actually can't do justice to situationalism in the way we want it to. It's actually only objectivism that can, and that's really important because a lot of people get driven to cultural relativism because they see this situationalism. They want to capture situationalism, and they think that relativism is the only way to do it. But actually, I will argue cultural relativism can't really do that for you. You really need a sensitive, a complex, a sophisticated objectivism for that, which also just highlights how important philosophy really is. Sometimes we have amazing insights into things, but we're not quite sure how to frame them. Not at all because of a lack of intelligence or care, but because philosophy is difficult. And philosophers are able to do this not because they're so brilliant, but because they're actually fortunate enough to just have lots and lots of time to focus on this stuff and to listen to everybody else on it and argue about it over and over. And we actually get some insights, over time with some things. So that kind of sets up that video, that topic, but should also remind us that giving up cultural relativism does not mean you have to be absolutely rigid and inflexible and invariable about absolutely everything in ethics. No. If we're going to buy moral objectivism, which, as I've made clear in class, I think we should, we're not committed to saying everybody has to play the oboe. We can allow for some variation, and there's a lot of room for debate about what actually counts as right or wrong. I think it's important to get that out of the way, because I think sometimes when people are hearing these arguments against cultural relativism, there's more resistance than maybe there needs to be, because in their head they're kind of saying, yeah, okay, that argument sounds actually pretty persuasive, but if I actually accept that argument, then I'm going to be forced to accept this other thing I really don't want to accept. No, but you're not. You're not. Okay. And actually, we're not going to really do this in class, but sometimes I hear people make arguments, students make arguments. They're really great arguments. They're wonderful arguments, actually. Sometimes they'll argue, well, I believe in democracy, but that means I have to be a cultural relativist. And actually, I could give separate arguments. No, actually, cultural relativism is not going to guarantee your democracy. The majority, just really quickly, the majority of people might say, we don't want democracy. You can absolutely make sense of democracy on objectivism. I think actually it makes a lot more sense on objectivism than it can on relativism. I don't think cultural relativism, it's not guaranteed to secure democracy at all. There's a lot of other arguments that people give for cultural relativism where I think they're actually having real insight into the nature of ethics, but it's not cultural relativism that's going to get them that result. It's really a more sophisticated objectivism, which again, I think underscores how important philosophy is. A lot of times we're having real insights into things we don't see quite how to put it. Again, not because of a lack of intelligence or care or anything like that. This stuff is just really difficult. And philosophers are fortunate enough to be able to spend so much time thinking about this. They're able to dot I's and cross T's. And sometimes failing to do that can get us in trouble, because if we don't do that properly, we may get pushed into cultural relativism. But then that's got a lot of consequences a lot of us aren't going to like, and then we feel kind of trapped, and then we kind of don't even want to deal with it. And philosophy can really help us out a lot here. Okay, so let's get into the actual arguments. Just one more thing. We got to remind ourselves, what is cultural relativism, right? So there's a few ways we can approach this. We could say cultural relativism is a doctrine that each culture gets to make up its own ethics, create its own ethics, right? Whatever they say goes ethically goes for that culture. Whatever they say doesn't go for that culture. That's a very general, kind of loose way to put it. If we try to get a little more specific with it, and this goes back to question 1 on the assignment, the in-class assignment, we might try to characterize cultural relativism, other forms of relativism, other so-called meta-ethical positions in terms of the truth values that they would assign to what we might call an ordinary moral claim, and a moral claim such as, quote, torturing and murdering children for pleasure is morally forbidden, close quote, right? Again, I know that sentence may seem kind of bloodless. You want to say, it's not just morally forbidden, it's totally evil. Yes, I agree. I'm using morally forbidden because we're focused on a certain family of terms, these deontic terms dealing with duties and obligations, morally required, morally permissible, morally forbidden. We want to isolate a certain family of terms. We're using those terms to express these meta-ethical positions, right? And again, let's just review our 4 positions really quickly. The non-cognitivist, what would they say about that sample sentence, that ordinary moral claim? They would say it's neither true nor false. In other words, they would say it lacks truth value. And they would say the same for all such moral claims. The nihilist would say all such claims are false. Relativism, well, it's not non-cognitivism, it's not nihilism. It's different, right? I mean, some people might want to use it for those other things, but then we're confusing our positions. So let's use separate terms for our separate positions and keep them straight. We want to track all of our positions. What would relativism say? Well, it can't say that it's neither true nor false. That's non-cognitivism. It can't say it's just false. That's nihilism. It can't say it's just true, always true, universally true, because that would be objectivism, or at least a reasonable version of objectivism, right? The objectivist could say this claim is false for all times and all places, so it's not actually wrong or bad to do this to children, but you're not going to find any objectivists saying that. I mean, technically they could, but they don't. Objectivism is saying these kind of claims are either true or false for all times, all people, all places, or at least it's certain general moral claims like this are, because again, they can allow for some variation from place to place, time to time. We're not going to get into the details of that here, right? But something like you're not allowed to murder for pleasure, that would be a good candidate for a claim that a moral objectivist would say, that one, yeah, you're never allowed to do that. That's always wrong. All times, all places, all cultures. We don't need a lot of nuance for that, right? I mean, honestly, I could already start thinking of some cases where an objectivist might want to draw some distinction. What if the fate of the whole world depended on it? You know, aliens came and said, if you don't murder one innocent person, we'll blow up the whole world. Okay, let's not get into that. You're not allowed to murder. How about, well, that wouldn't actually be killing somebody just for pleasure, though. That would be actually saving the whole human race. So if we just take, like, you know, that original claim I gave you, you know, murdering somebody purely for pleasure and purely for pleasure is morally forbidden. I think pretty much all moral objectivists would say, yeah, right for all cultures, all times, all places. We don't need a lot of nuance for that one. Okay. What's the relativist going to say then? The relativist is going to say, again, they're not saying it's not true or false. That's non-cognitivism. They're not saying they're just false. That's nihilism. They're not going to say it's just true. That's objectivism, right? What are they going to say? They're going to say, well, it can be both true and false, even at the same time. Right? That a claim like this could be true and false at the same time. For what? Relative to what? Well, relative to something, or relative to what? Relative to different individuals, different cultures. There might be other options as well. But the two most popular forms of relativism are individual relativism and cultural relativism. Individual relativism is each individual gets their own morality. Cultural relativism is each culture gets its own morality. Now, if that's the view, that each culture gets its own morality, right, then different cultures, well, they can have different moralities, right? So it might be in Italy, they say you're not allowed to torture or murder children for pleasure, but maybe in France, they say you are allowed. And so that sample moral claim, that example of an ordinary moral claim, that can be true or false in different cultures at the same time, or true and false for different individuals at the same time. It could also be true and false for the same individual at different times, or the same culture at different times. But it could be true or false for different individual, true and false for different individuals, different cultures at the same time. And again, we're going to focus on cultural relativism. So here's how we could take it. That claim is true or false for each culture, depending on, let's just say, what the majority of people there believe. We could say what the majority of people there accept, what the majority of people act. Let's just keep it with this. It's true or false for a culture, depending on what the majority of people in that culture believe, right? And in class, we looked at a more general definition. For all actions X, we can define these deontic properties for items other than actions. We're going to focus on actions. For all actions X, that action is morally required or morally permitted or morally forbidden in a particular culture C, just in case the majority of people in C believe it has that property. Morally required, permitted, forbidden. There it is. That's how we're going to take cultural relativism. All right. This one more quick thing to touch on before we move on to the arguments. Okay. And actually, I think what I might do is I might actually stop this video when I'm done and upload it separately just to manage the length of these videos. Okay. So, someone actually could point out there's a little bit of a potential problem with the way I characterized nihilism and objectivism. Because it might have sounded like I'm saying that the moral objectivist never says any of these claims are false, right? The way I said it was, well, the nihilists will say they're false. The objectivists will say they're true. It's not. It's not that the moral objectivist says all of these claims are true. They're saying some of them at least are true. If they're saying that all these claims are false, that's nihilism. But a moral objectivist is not required to say all these claims are true. Actually, that would lead to logical contradiction, right? So this might be a little bit unclear because I just used one example and then I said other sentences like it. And so you might not be sure, well, what other kind of sentences are we talking about? So let's clarify that now. So what would count for our purposes is an example of an ordinary moral claim, or you might call it a first order moral claim, something like this. Again, torturing and murdering children for pleasure is morally forbidden. But what would be another one? That it's required, that it's morally required. That would be another example of such a claim. Now, the moral objectivist can't say those are both true objectively, because that would just be a logical contradiction. That action can't be required everywhere and forbidden everywhere. Forbidden and required are supposed to be mutually exclusive. They're like opposites, right? So, yeah, the moral objectivist definitely can say, will say, all sorts of these kind of claims are false. Objectively so, but they're also going to say all kinds of them are objectively true. The nihilist is going to, the nihilist is a kind of an objectivist. They're just a really pessimistic one, is the way you can think about it. They just think they're all false, right? But in another way, maybe we don't describe them as an objectivist because at least one way. Well, actually, let's not actually chase that down. Let's just let that one lie. I don't want to overcomplicate things here. Actually, I will just add a few more things to this before I close out because it'll be helpful. And then actually you can use this video to review question number 1. To help get at this difference between moral objectivism and cultural relativism. I use these examples in class, but I'll use them again. They can be helpful. And I know some of you, missed the class where we talked about this, even though we did review it a bit. But anyways, here goes. I think here's some helpful ways to get at this. One is if we look at laws of states versus the laws of nature. So again, we tend to take the laws of nature as really existing, and we don't really think about it too hard, though honestly, there's some really great philosophical questions we could raise about that too, but let's not do that here. Let's just talk about the laws of nature the way we normally talk about them. They're real, they exist, they're objective. Our minds don't create them. Our language doesn't create them. We don't create them at all. We discover them. We could be ignorant of them. We could be wrong about them. Gravity existed, so laws of gravity existed 2,000 years ago, even though nobody understood what gravity was 2,000 years ago. Again, it was Sir Isaac Newton that discovered universal gravitation. If you really want to be technical, there were some philosopher, scientists who would speak of a quality of heaviness in Latin that they called gravitas. It was not gravity. I'm not going to really go into here, how did Aristotle think about this? How did Kepler, how did Galileo? I chatted a little bit about that in class. I'm not going to do that again. If you're curious, you could ask me about it. But it was Newton who died only 300 years ago, 1727. It was Newton who discovered universal gravitation. So gravity, and so the laws of gravity existed 2,000 years ago, but nobody knew it was there. And actually, it turns out Newton got stuff about gravity wrong. So to say something is objective in this sense is to say we don't create it, we discover it. And we'll also add here it holds universally, or at least wherever relevant, right? So gravity holds everywhere in the universe. It's the same laws that hold everywhere in the universe, okay? Ethics, we could say, holds everywhere, at least where there are people or things with enough intelligence and free will, something like that, okay? That's the idea. That's how we think of the objectivity of the laws of nature. And then we also talk about the laws of morality, right? It's an interesting history to that. All of this, the talk of laws of nature, laws of morality, very interesting history. So that we won't get into here, but we talk about laws of nature. We talk about laws of morality. For objectivism, there are laws of morality, and they're like the laws of nature. They are discovered, not created. We can be ignorant of them. We can be wrong about them. Morality, not exactly like physics in every conceivable way, of course, but in this sense, the laws of morality are like the laws of nature. They're objective, they're discovered, not created. That's if moral objectivism is true. On cultural relativism, the laws of morality, if we're going to talk like that as relativists, which we can, they are like the laws of states. By states, I mean like Illinois, Wisconsin, Missouri, but also nations, nation states, United States, Canada, Mexico, so forth, so on. Those kind of laws are created, not discovered, at least arguably. It's a natural way to think about it. And they're created, not discovered, and they can vary from place to place, right? I use this example all the time in class. Marijuana is legal to purchase and to use in some states in the United States, but not others. And that can change over time. And it's created, not discovered. Who creates those laws? We do, we the people, right? For right or wrong, better or worse, that's how it goes. Okay. Again, not at all a fan of drugs, but actually there's some really great debates you could have about, even if you think drugs are not good to do, should they be illegal? Really interesting questions to be asked about that. And should it depend on what drugs we're talking about? Okay. All right. That's actually, we're not even going to get into that in class. That's for another class. All right. So that helps us understand a little bit the difference between objectivism and cultural relativism. Another way we can look at this distinction is to look at the distinction between description, descriptive and normative. Well, we could say, I hate saying this, it's kind of bad English. I was going to say descriptive and normative descriptions of reality. That sounds kind of bad in English. How about descriptive and normative accounts of reality? So a descriptive account of reality is saying the way it is. The way it is. For better or worse, like it or not, you're not taking a stand on whether it's good, bad, desirable or undesirable. You're just saying how things are. So here would be a descriptive account of society. People sometimes murder one another for profit. People sometimes murder one another for pleasure, right? That would be a descriptive account of reality. You're not taking a stand on whether it's good or bad. You're just kind of like being a scientist, right? Okay. A normative account would be saying how things should be, according to some kind of norms, right? So a normative account of society would say there should be no murder for pleasure. There should be no murder for profit. That those things are wrong. They're bad, evil, that they're forbidden. We shouldn't do them. Wrong, ... Okay? So how is this distinction helpful? Because again, sometimes when people encounter cultural relativism, they think all it's saying is that cultures exist, and sometimes they agree on things, but a lot of times they don't. That's not what cultural relativism is saying. Or rather, it is saying that, but everybody says that. Nobody doubts that. That's not, and I mean, it's fascinating from an anthropological point of view, but philosophically, I mean, if that's all you say, it's pretty boring. It doesn't tell you anything yet about what's right or wrong. It's just how things are, not about whether they should or shouldn't be a certain way. Cultural relativism is not just saying there are different cultures and people have beliefs that often are shaped by their cultures, ... We all know that. What it's saying is whatever that culture believes really does fix the norms. The norms are really existing. Related to this, I think sometimes people have the idea that relativism is really just a form of nihilism or non-cognitivism. It's not really saying morality exists. It's just saying people have beliefs about it. But cultural relativism does say morality is real. It says it's very much real. It's just relative. And if that seems strange to us, then again, the example I've used in class I like to use is there are states in the United States where it is illegal to use certain drugs. In other states, it may not be illegal to use those drugs, but the fact it's legal in some states and not others doesn't mean law doesn't really exist. You could be, the example I keep using, you could be fined, you could be arrested, you could go to jail, you could do time. That's real. Like the police who arrest you, they're not make-believe, they're real. The jail you could go to, it's real, not make-believe. Just because something is relative doesn't mean it's not real. What relative really just means here is it doesn't hold absolutely everywhere. It holds in a limited range of cases, right? That's what we're talking about. So it's not just that the relativist is giving descriptive accounts. Everybody can agree on the descriptive accounts. The non-cognitivist, the nihilist, the cultural relativist, the moral objectivist. They can all agree on the descriptive accounts. They do not agree on the normative accounts. The non-cognitivist says there really are no normative accounts. So does the nihilist in different ways. The objectivists and the relativists say, no, there really are norms. Things really are good, bad, right, wrong. There are certain things you should do, you shouldn't do, you're required, you're forbidden, you're permitted. They differ on the scope of those, how far they extend, how many different sets of them there are, right? That's where they're disagreeing. The objectivist, if we set aside situational differences, is saying there's like one set of norms for all people, all places, all times, at least one general set. There could be some variation, right? The relativist is saying each culture gets its own set from scratch, right? Just one more example, to try to illustrate this. I used a few different versions of this in class. I'm going to use a new one here. A certain culture might believe that if you have a certain illness, let's say asthma, or sorry, I don't know if we call asthma an illness, maybe we just call it a condition. Sorry, let's say you have pneumonia. I mean, it could be asthma, but I'm going to stick with pneumonia. That's what I meant to say. If you have pneumonia, a culture might believe all you have to do to cure pneumonia, and it'll cure it right away in 30 seconds, you have to eat a handful of earthworms. They could believe that. It doesn't mean it really works. It doesn't mean it's really effective. Just because a culture believes something doesn't make it true for themselves or anybody else at all. Plenty of cultures believed that the earth was the center of the universe. That's not true. If you had a flat earth, a culture where everybody believes in flat earth, it's not like the earth is flat for them and round for us. And no, when I say round, I don't mean perfectly spherical. That's not what round means, right? Or at least not at all what it has to mean, right? I'm not saying it's a perfect sphere, but it's round. It's roundish, right? The earth can't be both flat and not flat like that. It's one or the other or neither, right? For everybody, whether they like it or not, right? Cultural relativism is saying that people have this power to create real morality just by agreement. That might sound kind of crazy, but it's not, even though I'm not a relativist at all, there's at least something you could kind of say about that, right? I mean, we do create promises with our words, but actually the objectivists would say, well, it's more, maybe a little more than that. Maybe you create the promise, but the moral obligation to keep it, all things considered, you don't create that, right? That's comes from some other source, wherever you think the objective morality comes from, God, nature, logic, nothing, whatever it is, right? But there are some things we can create with our minds and our words. We can create promises, we can create stories, we can create a lot of things. Now, that's not the same as morality necessarily at all, of course. But we do create laws with our minds and our words. Then again, a lot of us also recognize that morality and law isn't the exact same thing. The law could permit slavery while morality doesn't. The objectivist can easily make sense of that. So can the cultural relativist, actually. It could be the majority of people in the culture have certain beliefs that fix morality one way, but they don't have democracy or a democracy that perfectly reflects the will of the people. So even if cultural relativism is true, you could actually have you could have a kind of a chasm between a kind of a divorce or a cleavage between a separation between the law and the morals. But if you're really thinking though of morality as something kind of like laws of states, well, you could say, well, look, we get to create those things with our minds, right? So I mean, it's not so far from what we've said, we haven't seen anything yet to suggest that there's anything really problematic in that kind of an approach. That'll have to wait to the arguments that I get to in the next video. But I hope this kind of clarifies things. We're going to be objectivist about whether earthworms cures pneumonia. Eating earthworms cures pneumonia. We're going to be objectivists about that. That kind of ties in what we said earlier about broken bones. Cultural relativists will say that whatever a culture says about morality, it does create real morality. It's limited to that culture, but it's real. And it's created, not discovered. And in a sense, the culture can't be wrong about it. Whatever it says goes. Objectivism's going to say not so. You can believe that all you want, but it doesn't mean it's true. Just one little last flourish on this. Some people might say, but they really believe it. But people can be wrong. And some people say, but if they really believe, yeah, but they can be wrong. People believe the Earth was at the center of the universe. They were just wrong. And you might say, yeah, but what if they don't have a way to figure it out? Well, I don't know if it was determined that we ever would have been in a position to figure out that geocentrism was wrong, but yet it was still wrong. We want to be careful to separate truth from our access to truth. All of humanity is certainly all of a culture, but it could be all of humanity. It could be we believe something that's wrong, even if we have no way of correcting ourselves. I mean, we hope not, but that could definitely happen. Let's not mix up the question of how do we know what's right with what's really right. Let's deal with that epistemological question later, right? Just because a culture really, really believes something doesn't mean it's true. And if we start to say, well, but we don't want to be judgy, do you really want to say you should never criticize any culture for anything, even genocide? I mean, all right. We'll get into that in the next video. All right. Hope this was helpful. Yeah. See you in the next video. Peace.